All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something that I think is really crucial, especially as these deep learning models get bigger and more complex. We're talking about efficiency and deep learning and really, the sustainability of it all.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of people don't think about. It's very easy to get caught up in just the model performance and the accuracy and all these sorts of things.
Right, right.
But training these massive neural networks using back propagation, it takes a lot of computing power.
It really
And
does.
that translates into, big energy costs and a pretty hefty carbon footprint. And that's not good.
Not good at all, especially for those of you, out there who are trying to stay ahead of the curve, learn these techniques, build these models. You need to be aware of this stuff and understand how to do it efficiently.
Absolutely. So today we're going to take a deep dive into a new approach called decorrelated backpropagation, DBP for short.
DBP, okay?
It's a way to train these models more efficiently and in a much more sustainable way. We've got a lot of great resources to help us unpack this. We've got research notes that really give us the context, a study guide with a quiz, which is always fun. Helps us make sure we really understand the core concepts.
Love a good quiz.
Yeah, me too, me too. Then we've got a briefing document summarizing the core research paper and an FAQ to clear up some of those, trickier points.
Perfect. So DBP, declarated backpropagation. The name kind of hints at what it's about, but in simple terms, what's the core idea here?
Well, the key is to derelate the inputs to each layer in the network.
Okay, derelate. So what does that mean exactly?
So imagine each layer in your neural network gets a bunch of signals, right?
Inputs, features.
Right, exactly. Features, inputs, whatever you want to call them. Now, if those signals are highly correlated, if they're basically saying the same thing, it makes it hard for the network to figure out which signals are really important.
Hard to tell what's actually driving the performance.
Yeah, exactly. So DBP aims to reduce that correlation to make those signals more independent so the network can learn more effectively. And, this isn't a totally new idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's been earlier work hinting at the benefits of this.
Huh, interesting.
There's a paper by Ahmad and others from 2017. They were looking at decorrelation in shallower networks, not as deep as what we use today, but still, they saw some promising results.
Okay, so there's a historical precedent here.
Definitely. And even further back, Amari in 1998, he laid some of the theoretical groundwork. He showed that decorrelation can help align the learning process with something called the natural gradient, which can lead to faster and more efficient optimization.
So smarter, not harder. I like it. But let's get back to the challenge at hand, right? The inefficiency of standard backpropagation. It's computationally expensive, right? It gobbles up energy and it leaves a big carbon footprint. We see this concern echoed across a lot of our sources. Garcia Martin et al. In 2019, De Vries just last year, and Strubel and others back in 2019, they've all sounded the alarm.
They have. And, it's not just about the size of the models either. The briefing document points out that the backpropagation algorithm itself, the way it learns, is inherently inefficient. It's just not great at figuring out which connections in the network are most important, especially when those inputs are correlated. So it ends up taking a lot of steps, a lot of computations to get to a good solution. And all those computations, well, they require energy.
Right, so it's like taking the scenic route when you could just take the highway.
Perfect analogy. So, given these concerns about efficiency in the environment, there have been attempts to address this, right? Our study guide mentioned some previous work on using a technique called whitening, which is related to decorrelation. There's the work of Wonky and others from 2018, Luo in 2017, and Desjardins et al., even earlier in 2015. They all had this idea, but it seems like none of them really hit the mark.
Yeah, what was holding them back? Why didn't those earlier approaches take off?
Well, they ran into some roadblocks. First, they often added a lot of computational overhead. Calculating and applying these whitening transformations took extra time, extra processing power. So even though they might have needed fewer training epochs, the actual wall clock time to train the models didn't really improve that much.
So like trading one form of inefficiency for another.
Yeah, exactly. And there's another potential issue that Wadia and colleagues pointed out in 2021. They found that sometimes overly strict whitening can actually hurt the model's ability to generalize, to perform well on new data it hasn't seen before.
Ah, so it's a balancing act. You want to decollate enough to speed things up, but not so much that you sacrifice performance.
Precisely. And that's where DBP, decorrelated backpropagation, comes in. This new work, led by Dalm and his colleagues, claims to overcome those limitations. They say they've found a way to implement decorrelation efficiently without sacrificing performance and even potentially improving it.
Okay, now we're talking. So how does DBP actually do this? How does it achieve this magic?
Well, it's not magic. It's clever math and algorithms. Here's the gist.
All right, lay it on me.
So each layer in the network gets an input, let's call it Z, this Z might have correlated features, right?
Right, the problem we're trying to solve.
Exactly. So what DBP does is it transforms this Z into a new representation, let's call it X, using a special matrix, R. This R is the decorrelation matrix. So we have X equals R times Z.
Okay, so they're multiplying the input by this matrix R, but what's so special about R?
Well, R is learned during training, along with the usual weight matrices. And it's learned in a way that minimizes the correlation between the features in X. So X ends up being a decorrelated version of Z.
Ah, okay, I'm starting to see it. So instead of just feeding Z directly into the layer, they first decollate it using this R matrix.
Exactly. And here's the really clever part. They combine weight matrix, W, and the decorrelation matrix, R, into a single matrix, A, before doing any calculations. So instead of doing W times R times Z, they do W times R times Z, which is the same as A to Z.
Okay, so they're pre-computing this A matrix. That saves some computation, right?
Exactly. Less work during training, and also you only store A after training, not both W and R. So it's efficient in terms of both time and space.
Smart. But how do they actually learn this R matrix, this decorrelation matrix?
That's where the decoration learning rule comes in, equation 7 in the paper. It's basically an update rule that tells us how to adjust R at each step of the training process to make X as decorrelated as possible.
And this rule, it's designed to be efficient, right? Because we don't want to add a ton of extra computation just to calculate R.
Right, exactly. And this rule is beautifully efficient. It relies on calculating some statistics from the current batch of data, specifically the covariance and variance of X. These statistics can be computed very quickly, allowing for frequent updates to R without slowing down training.
Very cool. But they also tested this on ResNets, right? These deep residual networks, those are all the rage these days in computer vision. And they have this specific structure with convolutional layers. How does DBP handle those?
That's another key innovation. They realized that trying to decorrelate the entire feature map in a convolutional layer would be way too expensive. Those maps can be huge.
Yeah, lots of pixels, lots of channels.
So they came up with this idea of patch-wise decorrelation. Instead of decorrelating the whole thing at once, they break the feature map into small patches and apply the decorrelation rule to each patch individually.
Ah, so they divide and conquer.
Exactly. And then after decorrelating each patch, they use a standard one-by-one convolutional layer. It's all very neatly illustrated in figure 2 of the paper.
So it's like they're zooming in and decorrelating these little neighborhoods within the feature map?
That's a great way to put it. And there are a couple more tricks they use to make DBP even more efficient for ResNets. First, they found that they don't need to use the entire mini batch of data to update R. They can just use a small random sample, like 10%, and still get good results.
So they're being even more efficient with the data they use.
Yeah, and it barely affects performance. And second, as we mentioned earlier, they combine W and R into A before doing the forward pass. This pre-computation saves a lot of time and memory.
Awesome. So we've got this really innovative algorithm with all these clever optimizations. But the real test is, does it actually work? Does DBP actually deliver on its promises?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer that, they ran experiments on ImageNet using a ResNet 18 architecture.
ImageNet, that's like the gold standard for image recognition benchmarks.
It is. And the results were impressive. First, they showed that DBP effectively reduces correlations across all layers of the network.
So it's doing what it's supposed to.
Yep. And then the really exciting part, DBP converges much faster than standard backpropagation, not just in terms of epochs, but in actual wall clock time.
Meaning it actually trains faster, even with all the extra computations for decorrelation.
Yes. And not only that, but it also achieves higher accuracy.
So faster and better, that's a winning combination.
Right. On ImageNet, DBP reached 55.2% accuracy, while standard backpropagation only got to 54.1%, and it did this in just 2.3 hours compared to 3.7 hours for backpropagation.
That's almost a twofold speed up. And what about the environmental impact? They measured that too, right?
They did, and it's good news. They estimated that DBP reduced carbon emissions by about 640 grams of CO2 equivalent compared to backpropagation.
That's significant. So it's not just faster and better, it's also greener.
Exactly. And there are even more interesting tidbits in the appendices. They found that DBP actually generalizes slightly better than backpropagation. And the cool thing is, these benefits seem to hold across different architectures, not just ResNet 18. They tested it on AlexNet, ResNet 34, ResNet 50, and they saw similar improvements.
So it's not a one-trick pony. DBP seems to have some real potential, but as with any new technique, there are always limitations and areas for future research.
For sure. The authors acknowledge that DBP does introduce some overhead, mostly in terms of memory, to store those decorrelation matrices.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But they're already thinking about ways to mitigate that, maybe by using sparse matrices or low-rank approximations. They also emphasize the need for careful hyperparameter tuning, finding the right learning rates and the optimal balance between decorrelation and whitening.
Right, tweaking the knobs to get the best performance.
Yeah, and they suggest some exciting future directions, applying DBP to other areas like reinforcement learning or training those massive language models everyone's talking about.
That would be huge.
Yeah, and there's a lot more theoretical work to be done, really understanding why decorrelation is so beneficial, and maybe even coming up with even better decoration strategies.
So it's like opening a whole new door in deep learning research.
It really is. And, the connection they make to biological neural processing is fascinating too.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that.
So it turns out that decorrelation and whitening-like processes have been observed in the brain, particularly in sensory systems.
So maybe the brain is already doing something similar to GBP.
It's possible, and that suggests that these principles of decoration might be fundamental to efficient information processing, both in artificial and biological systems.
That's mind-blowing. So to sum it all up, DBP seems like a major step forward in making deep learning more efficient, more accurate, and more sustainable.
It does. The speedups they've achieved, the higher accuracy, the reduction in carbon emissions, it's all very promising. And the way they've designed the algorithm with all these clever optimizations, it's just really elegant.
It is, and it really makes you think, if decorrelation is so beneficial for artificial networks, maybe it's a key ingredient for intelligence in general. And with the increasing demands of AI, finding ways to train these models efficiently and sustainably is becoming more and more important.
Couldn't agree more.
So DBP, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. For those of you who want to dive deeper, I highly recommend checking out the research paper and the code repository. They're linked in the show notes.
It's worth a read.
All right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.